There is an enduring story about the Council of Nicaea that you will hear repeated in popular podcasts, in undergraduate history courses, in countless online debates, and in many widely read books. The story goes something like this. In the year 325, the Roman Emperor Constantine, having recently converted to Christianity for largely political reasons, called together the bishops of the Christian world and forced them to define the divinity of Jesus Christ by imperial decree. Before Nicaea, the story continues, Christians had believed in a more human Jesus. After Nicaea, by the will of a single ambitious emperor, Jesus became God. This particular narrative has been popularized in our time by writers like Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code, by Bart Ehrman in his more serious historical work, and by a long tradition of skeptical accounts of early Christianity, stretching back to the 18th century rationalists. There is a kernel of historical truth in it, which is why it has survived. Constantine did call the council. Constantine did formally propose the central word homoousios. Constantine did sign the decrees afterward and personally exile the dissenters. But the larger picture this story paints is wrong in almost every important way it matters. Today, in this 6th episode of our series on the Council of Nicaea, we are going to walk carefully through what Constantine actually did at the council, what he actually believed about Christianity, and what role the imperial office actually played in the theological decisions that emerged, because the question of how much Nicaea was a church decision and how much it was an imperial decree is not just a question for academic historians in a seminar room. It is a question that touches the very legitimacy of the Christian creed for every believer who recites it in church each Sunday. We must begin with the man himself. Constantine the Great was born around the year 272 in what is now Serbia, the son of Constantius Chlorus, a Roman general who would later rise to become one of the 4 emperors of the Tetrarchy under Diocletian, and Helena, a woman of modest social background whom traditional Christian sources venerate as a saint and whom Constantine personally honored throughout his reign. Constantine spent his early adulthood in the court of Diocletian and later Galerius in the Eastern Empire, where he would have been a personal witness in his 20s and early 30s to the horrors of the great persecution of Christians beginning in 303. We do not know exactly when Constantine began to take Christianity seriously as a personal faith, but the turning point, all the sources agree, was the famous vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in October of 312, which we discussed in our first episode. After that battle, Constantine became formally a patron of the Christian Church. He issued the Edict of Milan in 313, granting Christians full legal toleration alongside other religions. He restored confiscated church property in every province. He gave bishops civic privileges, including the right to manumit slaves. He funded the construction of the great basilicas, including the Lateran in Rome, Old St. Peter's, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. By the time he summoned the bishops to Nicaea in 325, he had been the most generous patron of the Church in its entire 300-year history, and he had been functionally a Christian by his own description in his letters for at least 13 years. But what kind of Christian was Constantine in the year 325 of the Council? The honest answer of modern historians is a complicated one. He was not formally baptized until the very end of his life, in 337, on his deathbed by, ironically and famously, Eusebius of Nicomedia, the very bishop who had been the chief defender of Arius at the
council 12 years earlier. He continued throughout his entire reign to hold the pagan title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the old Roman state religion. He continued to use solar imagery, the imagery of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, on his official coins for years after his Christian conversion. His personal theological understanding, as far as we can recover it from his surviving letters and speeches, was sincere but unsophisticated. He believed firmly in one supreme God, identified that God with the Father of Jesus Christ, and saw Christ as that God's special instrument, both of human salvation and of imperial favor toward himself. He was almost certainly not capable of grasping the technical philosophical distinctions that the bishops at Nicaea were arguing about with such passion. He could not have explained the difference between the words homoousios and homoousios in a written theological essay. What he could do, and what he absolutely cared about, with all the force of his will, was unity. The Church must speak with one voice, because his empire must speak with one voice. This is the key to understanding Constantine's intervention at Nicaea. He summoned the council not primarily because he wanted to define the divinity of Christ, but because he wanted the Church to stop arguing about it. The Arian controversy, by the year 324, had become a public scandal across every eastern city of the empire. Christians were fighting Christians in the streets. Bishops were excommunicating each other in public letters circulated to other provinces. Songs and slogans were being shouted across factional lines in the harbours and marketplaces. To Constantine, who had just spent 18 years of brutal civil war reunifying the Roman Empire by force of arms, this kind of internal Christian division was simply unacceptable. It threatened the very gift his new God had given him, namely victory and political peace. The letters Constantine sent before the council, which we still possess in their original Greek and Latin, are remarkable for what they emphasize and what they do not. He does not lecture the bishops on the metaphysics of the Trinity. He pleads with them to find a formula, almost any formula, on which they can all agree. He calls the Arian dispute, in one famous phrase that has caused theologians to wince ever since, a question of small and entirely unworthy import. He sounds sometimes more like a worried administrator dealing with a regional labor dispute than like a theologian engaging a question of salvation. Theology is not Constantine's concern. Unity is. When the council actually convened in May or June of 325, Constantine's role on the floor of the basilica was, as we saw in detail in episode 4, deliberately limited. He opened the council with a brief speech in Latin, urging peace and unity above all things. He attended the major sessions, seated on a low golden throne, placed deliberately below the level of the bishops, a deliberate gesture of imperial humility before the assembled church. He did not himself speak on theological questions during the substantive debates. The actual theological work was conducted between bishops on theological grounds, drawing on Scripture and on the older patristic tradition stretching back to Irenaeus and Origen. When the strict Orthodox party, led by Alexander of Alexandria and his deacon Athanasius, with crucial supporting voice from Hosius of Cordoba in Spain, who was Constantine's chief ecclesiastical advisor, recognized that the more flexible scriptural language Eusebius of Caesarea had proposed could still be read in an Arian sense, they began to look for a stronger and less ambiguous word. The word homoousios, on the historical record we have, was almost certainly introduced into the discussion by Hosius and Alexander themselves, with Athanasius's intellectual backing Constantine then formally proposed the word to the assembly from the chair. This is a categorically different thing from saying Constantine invented the term or imposed it as his own idea. He was the chairman who put the proposal of his theological advisers onto the table for a vote.
The result of this procedure was, however, an outcome that the Arians experienced, with some genuine justification, as imperial pressure. The word homoousios had not been on the agenda before the council convened. It had no obvious scriptural basis in any single passage. It had been, as Eusebius of Nicaea and others pointed out forcefully on the floor, actually condemned at the Synod of Antioch in the year 268 in connection with a different controversy. But it was now on the table, proposed by the emperor at the urging of the Orthodox party, and the political reality in that hall was that voting against the emperor's proposed formula meant accepting exile, deposition from one's see, and possibly worse, imperial consequences. Of the roughly 270 bishops in the room, only 2 refused outright to sign, Secundus and Theonas of Libya. Eusebius of Nicaea and his ally Theognis signed under internal reservation. The rest of the assembly signed. Modern historians have argued for centuries about how to evaluate this outcome fairly. Some, especially in the Reformed Protestant tradition, have insisted that Nicaea was a genuine theological consensus that imperial sponsorship simply happened to make possible at that historical moment. Others, especially in skeptical and revisionist accounts since the Enlightenment, have insisted that Nicaea was essentially an imperial railroad job dressed up in conciliar clothing. The truth, as so often in church history, sits somewhere in between these 2 extreme readings. What Constantine almost certainly did not do, however, even in the most aggressive, skeptical reading of the council, is impose a theology that the Christian Church did not already largely hold. The doctrine of the full divinity of Christ was not invented at Nicaea in 325. It is everywhere in the New Testament writings of John, Paul, and the letter to the Hebrews, all dating securely from the 1st century. It is explicit in the writings of Ignatius of Antioch in the very early 2nd century, who calls Jesus simply our God in a letter dated around the year 110. It is in the writings of Justin Martyr in the mid-2nd century, who calls the Son God begotten of God. It is in the writings of Irenaeus of Lyon at the end of the 2nd century. It is in the worship and the prayers of Christian communities everywhere we look in the early sources. The Council of Nicaea did not create the divinity of Christ as a Christian doctrine. It defined the divinity of Christ in a particular technical philosophical vocabulary, the word homoousios, that would exclude one specific alternative reading, the Arian reading. The vast majority of bishops at Nicaea would have happily signed a creed affirming the divinity of Christ without any imperial pressure at all. What imperial sponsorship may have done was to force the choice between homoousios and homoousios into the open and accelerate a decision that might otherwise have taken another full generation to crystallize. The most damning evidence against the simple imperial decree narrative is what actually happened after Nicaea. If the council had been simply an imperial railroad, then the result should have stuck once imperial authority continued to back it. The emperor's continuing patronage should have settled the matter for good. But it did not. Within just 5 years of the council closing, Constantine himself, under the influence of new advisers in his court, recalled Arius from exile, restored Eusebius of Nicaea and Theognis to their original sees, and began to back away publicly from the strict Nicene party. By the late 320s and early 330s, the Nicene party was actually on the defensive across the Eastern Empire. Athanasius, by then Bishop of Alexandria, after Alexander's death in 328, was sent into the first of his 5 separate exiles by an imperial court that had effectively switched sides. The next 25 years after Nicaea saw a long succession of emperors, including Constantine's own son, Constantius II, who actively supported various forms of subordinationist Arian or semi-Arian theology against the original Nicene formula. If Nicaea had been merely an act of one emperor's will, those subsequent imperial wills in the next generation should have erased it easily. They did not. The Nicene formula survived not because of imperial protection, which it largely lost in the decades after the council, but because a hard core of bishops, especially Athanasius, refused absolutely to surrender it, and were willing to suffer 5 exiles and 45 years of harassment for it. So the honest historical answer to the question that this episode began with is something like this. Did Constantine decide Christian doctrine at Nicaea? The simple answer is no. But he did create the political and institutional conditions under which the bishops of the Church could decide it themselves in a single moment. He paid for the travel of nearly 300 bishops from across the empire. He gave them an imperial palace to meet in for 2 months. He pressured them toward unanimity by his presence and by the implied threat of his disfavor. He proposed, at the careful advice of his Orthodox advisers, Hosius and Alexander, the central word that would define the final creed. He then enforced the result with exile and deposition for the dissenters. All of these are real exercises of imperial power, and we should not pretend otherwise. But he did not write the theology himself. He did not invent the doctrine of the Trinity. He did not even fully understand the doctrine he was helping to enforce. And when his own imperial inclinations shifted toward conciliation with the Arians in the years after Nicaea, the doctrine survived without him, and largely against him, through the absolute stubbornness of bishops who had come to believe in it on its own theological merits. The next episode of our series will follow that long after history, the decades of theological war and political reversal that followed Nicaea, and almost overturned it. But the question to sit with, before we get there, is this. If Constantine had never converted, if no Roman emperor had ever called any council at all, would the Christian Church eventually have arrived at the same conclusion about who Christ is in some other century, by some other route? Or was the Nicene faith we recite today, in some real sense, the unexpected and unintended gift of an emperor who barely understood it,